For 47 years, Bumpy Johnson carried the same straight razor. He never upgraded to a gun. Never needed to. Italian mobsters, corrupt cops, rival gangsters, they all feared that blade. But here's what nobody knows. The first time Bumpy used that razor, he was a scared 16-year-old boy trying to survive one night in Charleston, South Carolina. His hands were shaking. His heart was pounding so loud he could hear it in his ears. 3 men had cornered him in an alley behind Morrison's general store. They were twice his age, twice his size, and they had knives. Ellsworth had nothing but his fists and a prayer. This is the story of how a barber's gift turned a frightened child into the most feared man in Harlem. This is the story of how Bumpy Johnson got his razor. And more importantly, this is the story of why he almost never had to use it. Because real power isn't about drawing blood. It's about making your enemy believe you will. That lesson started on a hot summer night in the Deep South, when a teenage boy learned that survival requires more than strength. It requires strategy. Charleston in the early 1920s was a dangerous place for a young black man. Jim Crow laws ruled everything. White and colored signs hung over every water fountain, every bathroom, every restaurant entrance. The Ku Klux Klan marched openly through the streets. Black men disappeared for looking at white women, for talking back, for simply existing in the wrong place at the wrong time. Ellsworth Raymond Johnson was born on October 31st, 1905, in this hostile world. His family called him Bumpy because of a pronounced bump on the back of his head, a childhood nickname that would follow him to legend. His parents were hard-working people who taught him to keep his head down and his mouth shut. But Bumpy was different. Even as a boy, something burned inside him. A quiet defiance that scared his mother and made his father shake his head. The boy asked too many questions. He stared too long at men who expected him to look away. He walked with his shoulders back when every survival instinct should have told him to hunch forward and disappear. Charleston noticed, and Charleston did not like what it saw in young Ellsworth Johnson's eyes. By 16, Bumpy had already been in a dozen fights. Not because he went looking for trouble, but because trouble seemed magnetically attracted to him. He was not a large boy, standing about 5'8", but he was quick and he was smart. More importantly, he understood something that bigger, stronger boys did not. Fighting was not about winning or losing. Fighting was about making your opponent pay such a high price for victory that he would think twice before coming at you again. Bumpy learned this lesson from watching his father deal with white creditors who came to collect debts. His father always paid, always smiled, always said, "Yes, sir," and "No, sir." But there was something in his father's eyes, a cold calculation that said, "I am doing this because I choose to, not because I fear you." Bumpy absorbed that lesson. He practiced it in schoolyard brawls. He refined it in back alley scraps. And by the summer he turned 16, Bumpy Johnson had built a reputation in the black neighborhoods of Charleston. The boy was trouble. The boy would not back down. The boy was either going to end up dead or dangerous. Most people bet on dead. The night that changed everything started like any other summer evening. Bumpy had spent the day working at the docks, loading and unloading cargo for pennies on the dollar. His back ached. His hands were blistered. All he wanted was to get home, eat whatever his mother had saved for him, and collapse into bed. He took his usual shortcut through the alley behind Morrison's general store. It was faster than walking around the block, and at this hour, usually empty. But not tonight. 3 white men stood at the far end of the alley, passing a bottle between them. They wore work clothes, stained with sweat and alcohol. Their faces were red from drinking. One of them spotted Bumpy immediately. The tallest one, a man with a thick beard and small mean eyes, stepped forward and blocked the alley's exit. Bumpy stopped. His heart rate increased, but he kept his face calm. He had been in situations like this before. Usually, the best strategy was simple. Apologize, back away slowly, take the long way home. But something in the tall man's eyes told Bumpy that apologies would not work tonight. The tall man smiled. It was not a friendly smile. It was the smile of a cat that had cornered a mouse and wanted to play before the killing. His two friends spread out, blocking any escape route. They moved with the practiced coordination of men who had done this before. Many times before. Bumpy calculated his options in seconds. He could run, but they would catch him. The alley was too narrow, and they were too close. He could fight, but 3 against 1 with knives was suicide. He could scream for help, but who in Charleston was going to help a black boy against 3 white men? Nobody. The answer was nobody. Bumpy was alone, and these men knew it. The tall man pulled out a knife. It was a working man's knife, the kind used for cutting rope and gutting fish. In the dim light of the alley, the blade looked almost silver. The other 2 men produced similar weapons. They were not in a hurry. That was the worst part. They had all the time in the world to do whatever they wanted. And Bumpy could see in their eyes exactly what they wanted. They wanted to hurt him. They wanted to hear him beg. Bumpy made a decision. He would not beg. Whatever happened in the next few minutes, whatever pain they inflicted on him, he would not give them the satisfaction of hearing him plead for mercy. That was the only thing he could control. Not whether he lived or died, but how he faced it. He squared his shoulders. He looked the tall man directly in the eyes, and he said something that surprised even himself. He said, "You're going to remember this night for the rest of your life." The tall man's smile faltered for just a moment. He had expected fear. He had expected tears. He had expected the usual submission that came so easily in situations like this. But this boy, this skinny black teenager, was staring at him like an equal, like a threat. The tall man's grip tightened on his knife. "Is that so?" he said, his voice dripping with contempt. "And why's that, boy?" Bumpy did not answer. He did not have an answer. He had spoken from pure instinct, pure defiance. But in that moment, his words hung in the air like a prophecy waiting to be fulfilled. Then the back door of Morrison's general store opened. Light spilled into the alley, cutting through the darkness like a blade. An old black man stood in the doorway, silhouetted against the lamp behind him. He was thin, almost fragile-looking, with white hair and weathered skin. He wore a barber's apron stained with decades of hair and shaving cream. His name was Moses Freeman, and he had been cutting hair in Charleston for over 50 years. Moses took in the scene with one quick glance. 3 white men with knives. 1 black boy with nothing. A story as old as the South itself. Moses should have closed the door. He should have pretended he saw nothing. That was the smart play. That was the survival play. But Moses Freeman was 73 years old. He had buried 2 sons, one to violence and one to disease. He had nothing left to lose and nothing left to fear. He looked at Bumpy Johnson, and he saw something in the boy's eyes that reminded him of his own sons. Defiance, pride, the refusal to kneel. Moses stepped into the alley. The 3 white men turned to look at him. The tall one laughed. "Mind your business, old man," he said. "Unless you want some of what this boy's about to get." Moses ignored him. He walked past the 3 men as if they were furniture, as if they did not exist. He stopped in front of Bumpy and reached into his apron pocket. Bumpy tensed, not knowing what to expect. The old man's hand emerged holding something wrapped in a soft cloth. He pressed it into Bumpy's palm. Through the fabric, Bumpy felt the cool weight of metal. "Every king needs a sword," Moses whispered. His voice was barely audible, meant only for Bumpy's ears. Then Moses turned and walked back toward his door. The tall man grabbed his shoulder. "I told you to mind your business, old man." Moses looked down at the hand on his shoulder, then up at the man's face. "I cut your father's hair when he was a boy," Moses said calmly. "I remember when he wet himself in my chair. You want me to tell these boys about that?" The man's face went red with rage, then purple with embarrassment. His friends were already laughing. The tall man released Moses and turned back to Bumpy, His anger now doubled, but in those few seconds, something had shifted. Bumpy had unwrapped the cloth. In his hand, gleaming in the light from the open door, was a straight razor. It was old but perfectly maintained. The handle was polished bone, yellowed with age. The blade was German steel, honed to a surgical edge. Moses had used this razor for 50 years. It had shaved the faces of mayors, businessmen, criminals, and common laborers. It had touched the throats of 1,000 men. And now it was in the hands of a 16-year-old boy who had nothing left to lose. Bumpy unfolded the blade. The sound it made, a soft click of metal on metal, seemed impossibly loud in the silent alley. The three men stared at the razor. Their knives suddenly seemed crude, clumsy, inadequate. A straight razor in steady hands was faster than any knife. One slash across the throat, and a man was dead before he hit the ground. Every man in that alley knew this, and for the first time, the three attackers looked uncertain. Bumpy held the razor at his side. He did not raise it threateningly. He did not wave it around like a desperate man. He simply held it, the blade catching the light, and he looked at the tall man with those same calm, defiant eyes. "I'm going to walk out of this alley now," Bumpy said. His voice did not shake. His hand did not tremble. Whatever fear he felt was buried so deep that not even a trace showed on his face. "You can try to stop me, but before you do, ask yourself something. Are you willing to die tonight? Because I am." The tall man's mouth opened, then closed. He looked at his friends. They looked back at him, then at the razor in Bumpy's hand. Nobody moved. Seconds stretched into eternity. Then the tall man stepped aside. Just half a step. Just enough to create a gap. It was not surrender, but it was enough. Bumpy walked forward, the razor still at his side, his eyes never leaving the tall man's face. He passed so close that he could smell the alcohol on the man's breath. The man did not move. His friends did not move. And Bumpy Johnson walked out of that alley without a single drop of blood being spilled. Moses was waiting at his shop door. When Bumpy reached him, the old man nodded once, a gesture of respect from one survivor to another. "Keep it," Moses said, gesturing at the razor. "It served me well. Maybe it'll do the same for you." Bumpy looked at the blade in his hand. 5 minutes ago, he had nothing. Now he had something that felt like power. Not the power of violence, but the power of possibility. The power of making other men wonder what he might do. "Why?" Bumpy asked. "Why help me? Why give me this?" Moses smiled, and in that smile was 50 years of living under Jim Crow, 50 years of keeping his head down and his mouth shut, 50 years of watching young black men get beaten, lynched, destroyed. "Because I'm tired," Moses said. "Tired of watching boys like you get broken. Maybe you'll be different. Maybe you'll be the one who breaks them instead." He put his hand on Bumpy's shoulder. "But remember this, son. That razor is not a weapon. It's a question. Every time you show it to a man, you're asking him, are you willing to die for this? Most men aren't. That's your power, not the blade. The question." Bumpy went home that night and sat on his bed for hours, turning the razor over and over in his hands. He thought about what Moses had said. He thought about the look on the tall man's face when he stepped aside. That man had killed before. Bumpy was certain of it. He had the eyes of someone who enjoyed causing pain. But even he had stepped aside. Not because Bumpy was stronger, not because Bumpy was faster, because Bumpy had made him ask himself a question he did not want to answer. "Are you willing to die tonight?" The answer had been no, and that no had saved Bumpy's life. This was power, real power, not muscle, not weapons, not numbers. Willingness, the willingness to go further than your enemy, the willingness to make them believe you had nothing to lose. Bumpy Johnson was 16 years old, and he had just learned the most important lesson of his life, a lesson that would carry him from the back alleys of Charleston to the throne of Harlem, a lesson that would make the Italian Mafia back down, make corrupt cops look the other way, make the most dangerous men in America treat him with respect. The razor was just a tool. The power was in his eyes. Word spread through Charleston's black neighborhoods. The Johnson boy had faced down 3 armed white men and walked away without a scratch. Some said he killed them all and hid the bodies. Others said he had a gun, or a gang waiting in the shadows. The truth was simpler and more remarkable. He had a razor and a willingness to die. But in the retelling, the story grew. It took on mythic proportions. And Bumpy discovered something else that night. Reputation was its own form of power. Once people believed you were dangerous, you rarely had to prove it. The belief did the work for you. Over the next few months, Bumpy's life in Charleston changed. Men who had once looked at him as prey now nodded respectfully when he passed. Troublemakers who might have targeted him found easier victims. Even some white folks seemed to sense something different about him. A coldness in his gaze that suggested messing with this particular black boy might not be worth the trouble. Bumpy carried the razor everywhere, folded in his pocket, close to his heart. He practiced with it in secret, learning to unfold it quickly, to hold it steady, to project calm even when his insides were churning with fear. The razor became an extension of himself, but Charleston was still Charleston. Jim Crow still ruled. The Klan still marched, and a young black man with a growing reputation was a target, not a survivor. Bumpy's mother saw it clearly. She watched her son transform from a boy into something harder, something colder. She heard the whispers about him, and she knew that if he stayed in Charleston, he would end up dead or in prison. There was no other path. One night she sat him down at the kitchen table. She had saved money for years, coins hidden in a coffee can behind the stove. She counted out enough for a train ticket and pressed it into his hands. "Go north," she said. "Go to New York. Your cousin Margaret is in Harlem. She'll take you in." Bumpy looked at the money, then at his mother's face. He saw the fear there, the love, the desperate hope that her son might have a chance somewhere else. "What about you?" he asked. "What about the family?" His mother smiled sadly. "We'll manage. We always do. But you, Ellsworth, you've got something in you. Something that's going to get you killed down here. Up north. Maybe it'll get you somewhere instead." 2 weeks later, Bumpy Johnson boarded a train heading north. He was still 16 years old, a boy carrying everything he owned in a single bag. He had one change of clothes, $12, and a straight razor wrapped in cloth. He did not know what waited for him in Harlem. He did not know that within 20 years, he would control the most profitable illegal lottery operation in New York City. He did not know that he would sit across from Lucky Luciano and negotiate as an equal. He did not know that the Italian Mafia would learn to fear a black man from South Carolina who never carried a gun. All he knew was that he was leaving home, leaving his family, leaving everything familiar. And he was carrying with him a gift from an old barber and a lesson that would define his life. The train pulled away from the station. Bumpy watched Charleston disappear through the window. The streets where he had grown up, the alleys where he had fought, the neighborhoods where everyone knew his name, all of it shrank to nothing, swallowed by distance and time. Ahead was the unknown. Behind was a boy named Ellsworth who had been scared and powerless. That boy died somewhere on the journey north. By the time the train reached New York, only Bumpy remained. Harlem in the late 1920s was a revelation. For the first time in his life, Bumpy saw black people walking with their heads held high. He saw black-owned businesses, black doctors, black lawyers. He saw nightclubs where black musicians played for packed crowds, where black artists and writers gathered to discuss ideas that would have gotten them killed in the South. This was the Harlem Renaissance, a flowering of African-American culture unlike anything the country had ever seen. And, underneath it all, invisible to the tourists and intellectuals, was another world entirely. The world of numbers runners and policy bankers, of bootleggers and loan sharks, of men who operated outside the law because the law had never operated for them. Bumpy found work where he could. He loaded trucks, washed dishes, ran errands, but he kept his eyes open. He watched how power worked in this new world. He studied the men who controlled the streets, who collected the money, who commanded respect without wearing badges or carrying warrants. And he saw an opportunity. The same skills that had kept him alive in Charleston could make him powerful in Harlem. All he needed was a chance to prove himself. That chance came through a woman named Stephanie St. Clair. They called her Madam Queen, and she ruled Harlem's numbers racket with an iron will and a brilliant mind. She was from the Caribbean, elegant, educated, and absolutely ruthless when crossed. Madam Queen had built her empire from nothing, and she defended it against all comers, including the Italian mobsters who wanted a piece of Harlem's action. She needed soldiers, smart ones, loyal ones, men who understood that violence was a tool, not a solution. Someone told her about a young man from Charleston who carried a razor but never seemed to use it. A young man who could walk into a tense situation and walk out with everyone still breathing, but the problem somehow solved. Madam Queen summoned Bumpy to her office. She looked him over with those sharp, calculating eyes. She asked him about Charleston, about the alley, about the 3 men with knives. Bumpy told her the truth, all of it. When he finished, Madame Queen smiled. It was the smile of a queen who had just found her knight. "Most men your age want to prove how tough they are," she said. "You want to prove how smart you are. I can use that." Under Madame Queen's guidance, Bumpy Johnson rose quickly. He started as a collector, making rounds to pick up numbers money from the betting stations scattered throughout Harlem. But he was soon doing much more. When disputes arose between runners, Bumpy settled them. When rival operations tried to muscle in on Madam Queen's territory, Bumpy discouraged them. His methods were always the same. He would sit down with the offending party. He would listen to their complaints, their demands, their threats. He would nod thoughtfully, respectfully. And then he would reach into his pocket and pull out the razor. He never opened it. He never threatened anyone directly. He simply placed it on the table between them, that old bone-handled blade that had traveled all the way from Charleston. And he would ask one simple question: "Is this worth dying for?" The answer was almost always no. Bumpy resolved dozens of conflicts without ever cutting anyone. His reputation grew with each peaceful resolution. The man with the razor. The man who never had to use it. The man whose calm, cold eyes made you believe he would use it without hesitation if you pushed him far enough. By the early 1930s, Bumpy Johnson was Madam Queen's most trusted enforcer, and the razor had not drawn blood once. Years later, when Bumpy sat at his corner table in Wells' restaurant, when he negotiated with Lucky Luciano and faced down the 5 families, when he ruled Harlem as its undisputed king, he still carried that same razor. The handle was more worn now, the bone yellowed further by decades of handling, but the blade was still sharp, still perfect, still ready. Reporters sometimes asked him about it. Why a razor? Why not a gun like everyone else? Bumpy would smile and change the subject. But to those closest to him, to his wife Mamie, to his most trusted associates, he sometimes told the story of a hot summer night in Charleston, the story of 3 men with knives, the story of an old barber named Moses, who gave a terrified boy a chance at survival. "That old man taught me more in 5 minutes than most people learn in a lifetime," Bumpy would say. "He taught me that power isn't about hurting people. It's about making them believe you can, and more importantly, making them ask themselves if it's worth finding out." Moses Freeman died in Charleston, still cutting hair in the same small shop. Bumpy sent money for the funeral. He never forgot his debt. Bumpy Johnson died on July 4th, 1968, in Wells' restaurant, the same place where he had held court for decades. He was 62 years old. When they found him, his hand was resting near his jacket pocket, near the razor. 7,000 people attended his funeral, lining the streets of Harlem to pay their respects to the man who had protected them. employed them, helped them when no one else would. He was a gangster, yes, a criminal by any legal definition. But he was also something more. He was proof that a black man could stand up to the most powerful criminal organizations in America and not only survive, but thrive. He was proof that intelligence could overcome brute force, that strategy could defeat numbers, that respect, once earned, was more valuable than fear. And it all started with a razor, a gift from an old barber to a scared boy, a question that Bumpy Johnson asked every opponent he ever faced. Are you willing to die for this? For 47 years, the answer was always no. That was his power. That was his legacy. And somewhere in Harlem, they say, that razor is still waiting, still sharp, still asking its question to anyone foolish enough to need an answer. Now I want to hear from you. Bumpy Johnson carried that razor for 47 years and almost never had to use it. He proved that real power comes from respect, not violence. But here's my question. Do you think Bumpy would have survived without Moses giving him that razor? Or was the blade just a symbol, and the real weapon was always inside him? Drop your answer in the comments. And if this story moved you, hit that like button and subscribe. More untold stories coming soon.